It never was explained why they didn't get any detention for causing that, no matter how many times he repeated it. It was one of the few things that Fate did he was willing to put up with. Getting involved in that was pointless. All you did was get beaten up, covered in food, and ended up looking like a fool. He tapped the bruise on his arm, a reminder of the tables that had tumbled atop them. It had been pointless, that he could admit. But it had felt cathartic to prove he could still make changes, that the future wasn't set in stone. It took me 1,000 or so tries to win that. Maybe it would only take 1,000 more to bring an end to all this. Well, as long as he continued to smash his head against it. Luckily, no one had ever accused Jaune of not being persistent. No one had ever tried to worm their way into his good books so they could try and woo his teammate either. But it looked like the day was breaking all sorts of records. "You're asking me," Jaune said slowly, pointing to himself, "if you can try and become Blake's boyfriend?" Sun Wukong nodded, smiling brightly. "I feel like you should ask her." "I will, but not yet." The blonde faunus grinned. "I mean, it would be a bit weird if I just walked up and asked her out, wouldn't it? I need to get to know her first. Let her get to know me and show her I'm a cool guy she can rely on and not just some idiot looking for a good time." "Well, that's a fairly sound plan." Jaune nodded, still not quite getting the point. It was a good approach, especially with someone like Blake. She didn't appreciate people getting close or trying to be pushy around her. His succession in the past had usually come from surprising her, doing something nice and catching her attention, then letting her natural curiosity do the rest. At least Sun's plan to get to know her first would stop throwing Blake's walls up. But I still don't get why you're asking me instead of her. "See, I've been talking to Yang," Sun said. "Oh god." Jaune's head fell into one hand. "Nah man, she's pretty cool." "That's one way of putting it." "And she told me how you like the unofficial father of the team and all that." Jaune sighed, looking past the blonde in time to see the assorted girls and guys playing Remnant in the library, making enough noise to create a pocket of empty seats around them. "It's a joke of Yang's," Jaune explained. "You don't need to take it seriously." He really hoped Yang didn't send her own suitors his way. "I get that, man," Sun quipped. "But at the same time, I've seen the way they look at you. I was there at the docks when you came and saved our bacon as well. Don't think I've thanked you for that yet." Jaune waved it off. As callous as it sounded, he hadn't done it for Sun. He would have stepped in to protect Sun, and definitely didn't want to let the guy be hurt. But at the same time, he hadn't even recalled Sun's presence, and didn't feel right to be thanked for that. "Anyway, you're pretty cool and I know you're super protective of Blake. If you're willing to do all that for her, and since you're really strong too." "Rumors of my strength have been greatly exaggerated." "I thought it might be best to get your permission, your blessing if you will. Don't exactly want to invite the ire of a guy who burns down a warehouse district to protect his daughter's chastity." Was this what the rumors around Beacon were? Had Yang's stupid joke honestly taken hold this much? She could never know. She'd be too damn smug. They'd never hear the end of it. "You don't need my permission to try and chat out Blake." Jaune sighed, squeezing the bridge of his nose. "Nor do you need my blessing. But what if I want it? Would you... Why would you even? Because I think Blake values your opinion." "I think Blake values fish and smut." Jaune rolled his eyes. "I don't think she values anyone's opinion. She's too stubborn and won't listen to a warning unless she tries it and gets burned first." "Ha!" Sun burst out laughing. "That's such a dad thing to say." Jaune rolled his eyes but didn't comment. "So you're saying even if a total dirtbag came up, someone who wanted to sleep with her and brag to all his friends, you'd be fine with it?" Jaune's eyes darkened, lips pulling down into a snarl. No, he damn well wouldn't be okay with that. Blake was his friend, and in this life a teammate too. She'd been through enough. Too much, some might say, to have some arsehole trying to play with her feelings. "There you go," Sun said, poking his face. "That's why I'm after your blessing. I like to keep my internal organs where they are." Oh, come on. Jaune sighed. That didn't prove anything. Any friend would step in if another looked like they were being taken for a ride. It didn't even matter what gender they were. Sun had probably done the same from Neptune, and vice versa. Fine, he said. Do whatever you like. Sometimes it was easier just not to argue. I will. Sun slapped a hand on his back. I'll show you I'm a great guy and can be trusted with her. Just you watch. What was that all about? Weiss asked when he came to sit down beside her, shaking his head as the blonde faunus tried to engage Blake in conversation. He wants to seduce me so that he can seduce Blake. Weiss blinked. What? I didn't say it made sense. He sighed. It's Yang's fault. Ah. Weiss accepted that easier than she might have back at the start of Beacon. Or this Beacon, anyway. Sometimes it was hard to keep track which life he was in, or what he was doing. Hence his little slip with Pyrrha earlier. Remember, she's not Pyrrha in this life. The two of you are acquaintances at best. And speaking of acquaintances, you and Neptune, huh? Weiss glanced towards him, eyes narrowed. I saw the way his eyes lit up when you were introduced. He seems interested in you. Maybe it was cheating a little, given what he knew. But with scant little happiness remaining, it made sense to give her a little push. I did notice, she said, flicking some hair back behind her ear. He's handsome enough, I suppose. You suppose? He hadn't really paid attention, being dragged off by Sun while the introductions were going on. But usually Weiss would flush and stutter before Neptune. Had something changed? Or was she just putting the face on for him? Too embarrassed to admit how girlish she had been. He seems nice. Weiss shrugged before turning to him. You, on the other hand, have been watching Blake like a hawk all morning. Don't think I haven't noticed. What's bothering you? I'm just... He tried for an excuse, but gave up with a shrug. How does she look to you? She's as normal as ever. She's not. He tried to think of a way to say it without sounding suspicious, without having to give an explanation. I just thought she looked a little off. He shrugged. Maybe I'm imagining it. If she was still playing Remnant with the others, however, then that was a good sign. She usually stormed off, proclaiming them fools for not being serious about the White Fang. Had he done it? Had he managed to prevent that occurrence? Well, there is one thing. God damn it all! I didn't know if I was imagining it. Weiss said, glancing away. This morning she seemed a little... I suppose sluggish would be the word. Even during that silly display in the cafeteria that you roped me into, even during that unfortunate display, she completely ignored him. I feel like she should have been able to avoid Pyrrha's attacks earlier. She was getting hit with things she normally would have had no trouble avoiding. It's like she's fatigued. Jaune filled in with a sigh. Exactly. Not as obvious as with you. Her eyes narrowed at him, though there was no anger behind it. But she certainly looks like she's been spending too much time studying and not enough sleeping. Studying. Sure. Was that the excuse Blake was giving? She looked fine from what he could see, but that might have just been the makeup. He trusted Weiss's judgment. She had a good eye for details. It's not as bad as normal. Usually she would be angry and exhausted at this point. She's still acting like there's nothing wrong here. Did that mean his actions had managed to lessen the effect a little? Maybe it wasn't that he couldn't change this, but that he needed to push it a little further. Leave it to me, he said. I'll have a word with her. Leave it to you? Why scoff? Who are you and what have you done with my partner? Jaune blinked down at her. Since when do you actively offer to do anything? You'll forgive me if it takes a few moments to process that not only are you taking an active interest in Blake's welfare, but that you're willing to do this so alone? His partner fanned her face theoretically. I must be hearing things. Maybe I'm still sick. So you don't want me to? No. By all means, go ahead. Weiss waved a hand. leaning back to rest her head on the wall behind them. "It's nice to see you taking your responsibilities seriously. You could do to have a little more discipline with her." "I'm only her team leader." Jaune sighed, rubbing his face. "That's what I said." Weiss raised an eyebrow towards him. "What did you think I meant?" Damn Yang and Sun both. Now he was falling into that stupid trap. "Nothing," he said, turning back to watch the game. Yang had scooted over, letting Sun sit down beside Blake, who was shooting her partner an accusatory look. It was an odd scene, one he was used to seeing. It was only better now, with Blake not running away to work herself to exhaustion. But even when that did happen, it wasn't unusual to see them interact like that. Blake would be picky towards Sun for a while, but if he kept at it, she'd start to fall. Jaune's smile faded when he recalled what would happen soon after, that they'd never really survived long enough to see whether Sun and Blake went anywhere, whether anything took root between them. Something wrong? Jaune flinched slightly, looking down to see Weiss regarding him with an almost concerned worry in her eyes. When had she started to show concern like that for him? "It's nothing," he said again. "I was just thinking of my family." "You must miss them. It's only been 2 days, but I saw how close you all were. And they all seem to like you too," he said, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. At the time, there had been the concern that they wouldn't, that they would hate his team for being part of the reason he was still in Beacon. It just went to show how much he'd fallen out of touch with them over 1,000 or more deaths. He didn't know them like he ought to. "I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. And don't worry about Blake either. I'll deal with it." "Now I really need to find out where you've hidden my partner," Weiss muttered. "I'm not sure where all this sudden responsibility is coming from, but I won't complain." Oh, she would. If she knew what he had in mind, he'd make an effort to stop Blake. But when that inevitability failed, then the only option would be to keep doing what he'd done already. He wasn't strong enough to go fight against Roman and whoever else he brought into the scene. Crow was, however. But the man was also dangerous. He was Osmond's most trusted agent, and that position came about as a result of the sheer amount of experience and cunning that Osmond hid behind his jokes and alcoholism. It wasn't the first time he tried to influence the headmaster with letters, ultimatums, or other hidden messages. Some had been ignored, others acted upon, but it had never been the solution he'd been working towards. It had never been enough to stop Cinder's plan. It had stopped Cinder, once or twice, the woman forced to flee into hiding, chased out of Beacon. But that hadn't stopped the events that led to the fall of Beacon. She had simply launched her attack from within Vale, causing untold casualties and devastation. At least when she turned on them during the Vital Festival, he knew where she would be, what her plan was. Pushing her into hiding just added a random element he couldn't do anything about. But the White Fang would be easier. Fortunately, they were dangerous in their own right, none more so than Adam. But they were also a large organization, which meant there were weaknesses, things that could be exploited. "It looks like the game's wrapping up," Weiss reported, drawing his attention back to Yang's impending and inevitable victory. "Blake's patient looks fit to go with it," she added, watching as the black-haired girl stood up, saying something to Sun and Yang before storming away. It wasn't the dramatic explosion he was used to, but still a sign that she hadn't fully given up. "I'll talk to her." "Don't you have to talk with Dr. Oobleck first?" "I know. I'll find Blake after. Don't wait up for me." On an impulsive instinct, he flashed a teasing grin back at her. "Especially not in the rain. You'll catch a cold." He might have caught one too, had he not looked away when her eyes narrowed into slits of ice. Still, with the clock ticking on, it gave him the perfect chance to migrate to a warmer climate. His eyes caught Neptune's as he passed the blue-haired teen, noticed him break away from Sun and the others to saunter towards Weiss. Some things never changed. She would be happy with him. "Ah, welcome, Mr. Ark." Dr. Oobleck stepped aside as he opened the door, beckoning Jaune in. "I've just made some coffee. Would you like a mug?" "I'm alright, thank you." "It's not my personal blend, I assure you. I also have water or cordial." "I'm okay." he said, taking the chance to look about the man's personal quarters. It wasn't the first time he'd seen them, testament to his long time at Beacon, but they were still somewhat surprising. Knowing Oobleck, he'd always expected the man's room to look like a bomb had hit them. Such was his famous energy. Either that, or there would be a strange and unusual antiques across the walls, maps, charts, and other curiosities. That was never the case. The room was well organized and free of clutter, the only sign of mess being a small stack of papers on the desk that had fallen over, a discarded mug resting by them. The rest of the room was incredibly tidy. Take a seat, take a seat. The professor, or doctor, waved to one of the 4 couches surrounding a coffee table, sitting down himself on one of them. Jaune shrugged, taking the other but not leaning back onto it. He was tense, uncertain. This was new territory and he wasn't sure what the point of it all was. Miss Goodwitch said counseling. What a ridiculous idea. There'd never been anything like that before, which raised the questions what had necessitated it this time. Tell me, Mr. Ark, do you know why Miss Goodwitch had assigned you here? Jaune shrugged, not meeting the man's eyes. Mandatory sessions after what happened last term. Indeed, indeed. I would just like you to know that these are mandatory not only for you, but for any who are forced to go through what you did. You need not fear this as some terrible trap. Then, why isn't my teammate going through these? He asked. Blake had gone through the whole doc shenanigans time and time again. Yet it never seemed like she had to attend something like this. He'd have heard about it, mostly because she would have refused to attend. I think you must understand, the man said. These sessions are not for us to discuss what happened there, or how you were in danger. Huntsmen and huntresses are often expected to risk their lives, and such happens regularly during initiation. You are here because of something else. Can you tell me what that is? Wasn't that what Oobleck was supposed to tell him? There hadn't been anything unusual about the docks, had there? Well, one thing came to mind, making him wince. I didn't mean to cause all that property damage. Well, he had. It had been the only way to stop Roman. But he hadn't really desired to. It wasn't something he'd be repeating next time. How curious. Oobleck adjusted his glasses. Curious. I will see that my colleague was correct in her analysis. And tell me, Mr. Ark, what do you believe was the worst part of that night? My entrance. He answered easily. I didn't have the time to think of a better plan, so I had to wing it. He could have done better if he had more warning, but he still expected Ruby and Penny to bust in without him. Speaking of, should he do something about Penny? As I thought. Oobleck sighed. Do you know what I consider the worst part? The fire damage? It seemed obvious, really. He'd gone and burned much of the buildings down, many of which were still in use by companies. The economic impacts of his actions were probably still being felt. Not that he would have traded Blake for any of that. Not quite. I think the saddest part was the people who lost their lives there. Osmond told me there was no one in the warehouses. Jaune's eyes shot up. It was nighttime and the area was completely dead. There shouldn't have been any casualties. And yet they were. The teachers said. I'm surprised you don't remember them. They were claimed by your sword after all. Claimed by his... The White Fang? Jaune asked, relaxing just a little. I thought you meant innocent people. Does the distinction matter? Of course it does. Jaune scoffed. They were enemies. Children your age shouldn't have enemies, Mr. Ark. Especially not those that are willing to kill. Is that what this is? Are you trying to convince me I shouldn't have killed them? That I should have let them get away with killing my teammate? Was this some ridiculous love and peace for all crap he was going to be forced to sit through? Life wasn't fair and kind like that. The grim thrived, the innocent people died, and sometimes you had to kill in order to protect everything. Redemption was a nice word for those who could afford to risk the lives of their loved ones on the roll of a dice. As for his age, well, he felt he was more than old enough to have a few people he needed to remove. I don't begrudge your decision, Mr. Ark. On the contrary, I find myself quite impressed by the distance you were willing to go in order to protect a member of your team. That is a quality I can respect. What I worry about is how little time it took you to come to such a decision. how easily you are willing to write off the lives of others. So I'm a sociopath. He crossed his arms, leaning back. A fool jumping to conclusions might say so. Oobleck nodded. But I am not that. You've shown, in your roundabout way, that you care for your friends. I would not call that the actions of a sociopath. Similarly, although it is regrettable, you are not, nor will be the last student of ours to be forced into taking a life. That is why these mandatory sessions exist, after all. The doctor leaned forward, pointing his cup of coffee at Jaune. I'm not here to judge your actions, Mr. Ark. We have already done so and judged them just. I'm here to help you come to terms with them. I don't need that, Jaune said. It was a simple statement but nonetheless true. You could understand the gist of what the man was saying. This wasn't about changing his mind or punishing him. It was just a safety net to make sure their students didn't suffer any mental breakdowns from guilt or something. It was a way of showing they cared. He didn't begrudge them for that. It was just a smart and kind thing to do. But he still didn't need it. How many had he killed there, before Roman had torched the rest? 3? 4, perhaps? How many had he killed during his life? Hundreds? Thousands? Sometimes none had to die, because he died early himself. Sometimes, when he made it to the Vital Festival, he was forced to cut his way through swaths of White Fang terrorists. The numbers differed, but the results remained the same. Killing them didn't bother me. Jaune shrugged. I don't feel guilty about it. Miss Goodwitch said as much. Oobleck smiled. And I can see now that she was right, and that is why it is so curious. You have adapted to the burden incredibly well, suffering no side effects that aren't already part of your personality. Traditional studies might indicate your constant sleeping and exhaustion as a sign of the stress. But I am well aware of how you've been falling asleep on my lessons since school started. Are we done here? Jaune asked. You already said I don't need this. I said you have adapted well. I did not say you no longer needed these sessions. Oobleck turned away from him, drawing forth a small porcelain tray with a teapot in the middle. He placed it on the table between them, slowly lifting off the lid and sprinkling some leaves he plucked from a box of premium brand tea into them. Jaune watched as the man stirred them around with a long spoon, inspecting the water every now and then. It continued for a good 6 minutes, Jaune sitting silently the entire time. Can we— Shh. Oobleck shushed him with a little smile. Give it time, Mr. Ark. You have to allow good tea the time it needs to settle. So the man wanted to play that game, did he? Jaune sighed, leaning back and closing his eyes, willing himself to fall asleep. Normally it would have been easy, but with Blake running around doing exactly what he didn't need her to do, this session being a waste of his time and his stupid sleep earlier with Pyrrha, he felt too frustrated to fall asleep. His mind continued to whirl, plotting ideas and plans, little things he could do in order to stop Blake, to stop the White Fang. Ah! Oobleck sighed, finally placing the lid back on and pouring them both a mug. Jaune gazed down on it, wondering for a moment if there was a little something extra in it, something to loosen his tongue. It was a ridiculous thought. He was being foolish. To his irritation, it tasted really good. Let's not talk about the White Fang for now, the teacher said. Instead, why don't we talk a little bit about you? I'd rather not. Okay then. Oobleck gave up easily. Too easily. We could talk about the job of a huntsman if you desire. He didn't want to talk about anything. This was just a big, confusing waste of time. What do you think of a huntsman's job is, Mr. Ark? The job of a huntsman or huntress is to protect the kingdoms and the people from the Grim. A textbook answer. I'm surprised you've even read it. What do you think their role is? The job of a huntsman or huntress is to protect the kingdoms and the people from Grim and also criminals. You would rank criminality on the same level as a Beowulf. It depends on the case. Jaune shrugged, taking another sip of tea. Some crimes can be petty and solved by the police. Some can do more damage than the biggest Grim. Sometimes the worst monsters are those that wear human skin. I could not agree more. Dr. Oobleck tipped his mug. So it has been in history that we've been expected to hunt more than one type of prey. Did you know that is why we have sparring sessions against the human opponents? Jaune shook his head. He had wondered, once or twice, but the thought had never really bothered him. Training against humans gave him what he needed to fight against Cinder. I suppose that proves his point. It's regrettable, really. Perhaps in the future we will look back on this and consider it all quite barbaric. Personally, I believe it is an unfortunate necessity, though I doubt the textbooks will agree. History has an unfortunate tendency to forget the external factors that motivated people to make certain decisions. It's easy to judge from a high horse. Jaune said, "That it is. The life of a huntsman is never easy. We professors at Beacon are often considered the pinnacle, but believe me, I have made my fair share of mistakes. Probably less than he had. But then again, it wasn't the same and this wasn't a misery measuring contest. Every time he made a mistake, he got an opportunity to fix it. The man sitting opposite him had to live with the consequences. What would life have been like if he had been forced to accept a world where everyone died? It wouldn't come to that. He wouldn't let it. With regards to your little episode at the docks, I believe you made the right decision. I have a feeling you would have deeply regretted failing to act." Jaune shrugged, though he knew the words to be true. Blake's death would have resonated further than this life, because it would have been his fault. Just like it had been his fault when he had convinced Blake to fall in love with him, because Adam had killed her in response. "I can't. I love you." Mr. Ark. There was a hand shaking his shoulder, eyes snapping open as he saw the professor leaning across the table, closer than he had been before. When had the man moved? When had he closed the distance? "Are you okay, Mr. Ark?" "I'm fine." Jaune blinked, watching the man lean back with a worried expression. "Nothing is wrong. It was just a bad memory. He had plenty of those." "I see." Dr. Oobleck didn't sound convinced, but he didn't push either. "If I might ask something different, would you mind telling me why you rushed off to save your teammate without alerting anyone? And I don't mean to suggest it was a bad decision," Oobleck added when Jaune made to speak. "Only that I'm curious as to why you didn't seek to bring any support with you. My team was already out in Vale looking for her. Why not ask Team Reuben? I understand you were all quite close. That would have put them in danger, something he wasn't willing to do." "I didn't think of it." He lied. There was no way he could ask Pyrrha, Ruby, Ren, and Nora like that. Besides, he had been confident he could get by, even if the difference in strength between Roman and he had been bigger than he expected. Usually with 2 years of intensive training I can fight on his level, especially since I know most of his tricks. This time, the man had been just too strong, just too fast to get hold of. "Why not ask us teachers?" Oobleck asked. "We would have rushed to the aid of a student." "I didn't think of it." Jaune shrugged, shrugging hopelessly. He couldn't have explained to them why he knew, not in a believable way. What's more, it might have taken them some time to prepare. Blake hadn't that kind of time. "I think we both know neither of those answers are true, Mr. Ark," the teacher chastised, smiling over the rim of his mug. Jaune shrugged, as good as admitting it. The man wasn't a fool, but at the same time it wasn't like he had an answer he could really give. Still, this is not an interrogation. If you do not wish to answer a question, then you do not have to. Were you confident you could rescue Miss Belladonna alone? Confident enough, he shrugged. It worked. It did, Oobleck allowed, and in that regard, Timon has proven your decision correct. I just find it strange that you wish to do this all alone. You were placed into teams for a reason. Mine was out. You know what I mean, Mr. Ark. You could have asked for help rather than risk your life alone. What if you had died? Then he would have reset. It was no big deal. What if Miss Belladonna had died? Then he would have killed them all. He would have made them pay. It wasn't until he saw the green-haired teacher nod that Jaune realized the mug in his hand had cracked, his fingers crushing the handle. He took a deep breath and put it down, letting out a long sigh. It's not unusual for teams to form strong bonds between them. Oobleck smiled. I cared deeply for my teammates, and despite my better judgment, I continue to do so till this day. That said, you might want to spare a thought for how they feel about you in return. I can hazard a guess as how they feel. Jaune grinned loopsidely. Usually his team was a different team, but even then his relationship with Ruby was far different from this. Most of it revolves around the word exasperated. That's funny. Oobleck sighed. I would have said it revolved around the word love. Love. Jaune grimaced, leaning back as he regarded the man. Where on Remnant did you get that from? He asked. Sure, he loved his team. He loved all of them, both on Team Ruby and Juniper. In some cases he even made love to them, and being deeply in love with them. But that came from his experiences, from the fact that he had known them for centuries, because his entire life, nay, his entire existence, revolved around protecting them. Except that this life was different, because this was the first time he had ever considered doing something different, of abandoning that ideal in order to ensure a better attempt the next time. With that in mind, he'd done very little to engage his team, pretty much leaving them to their own devices for the entire first term. How would that lead to them liking him? You look generally surprised, Mr. Ark. The man sighed, sounding quite sad about the fact. Do you not see it yourself? I'm not sure what you're talking about, Jaune said slowly, uncertain. Are you not? Oobleck raised an eyebrow, settling his empty mug down and checking the pot before letting out a little sigh. The reason why seems so obvious to me, even if I am not part of your team. For Miss Belladonna, you saved her life, risking your own to ensure her safety. She visited you quite extensively while you were injured. They all did. That's just gratitude. It's being polite. As for Miss Xiaolong, I seem to recall a certain case of a man protecting her during Forever 4, taking quite the set of injuries as a result. How? Jaune cut himself off. You are wondering how I know? It seems to me a certain someone else was concerned for your safety too. He smiled. A little bird saw fit to tell on Mr. Winchester, saying even though you asked him not to, she didn't want to see you bullied anymore. Damn it, Ruby. It just had to be. That was exactly the kind of thing she'd do with that pure little heart of hers. Rest assured, Mr. Winchester served substantial detention for that display. Regardless, I seem to believe Miss Xiaolong became very close to you after that. Again. Jaune rolled his eyes. Gratitude. And technically, that one had started sooner because Yang had been supportive of him ever since he'd given in to Osborne and spared her a criminal sentence. That was my fault in the first place. As for Miss Schnee, whether it is treating her like a normal person or helping to put the team back together after your little divide, it seems obvious to me that the two of you have become closer. And third time's the charm. Jaune deadpanned. Gratitude, yet again. I'm not sure why you're so obstinate. Oobleck sighed. Do you believe you have not done enough to earn their trust? You bled for Miss Xiaolong. You killed for Miss Belladonna. Life and death was easy. He'd done both 1,000 times before. Those were nothing compared to what he normally did for them. He tried to be the best friend he could be. He listened to all their problems, comforted them when they were down. He trained his hardest. He protected them. He kept them safe. He'd done none of that this time. The teacher's scroll rang, the man looking at it with a little sigh. And it seems that is all we have time for, he said, silencing it with a click and collecting the 2 mugs. We're done then? Jaune said, standing up. For now, yes. I will contact you when I have time for another talk between us. Jaune growled, palming his face as he imagined the time that would be wasted. He needed to stop the White Fang before Blake could get involved. Hell, he still needed to talk to Blake tonight, not to mention find which room Cinder's team had been assigned to, keep them away from his, make sure Roman didn't try anything with his family. So many things, and there was no damn time. I don't need these sessions, he snapped, turning away and stalking towards the door. I killed those people and I don't feel a shred of regret about it. They made their decisions. They got in my way and threatened my teammate. I'll never regret it. I don't think you will. Dr. Oobleck remained calm, hands crossed before him. But it remains that you'll be seeing me until I deem our meeting's finished. I don't need counseling. We all need help, Jaune. Jaune paused in the doorway, looking back at the teacher who looked so calm, so bizarrely sympathetic. Help? He needed help? He'd been doing this for so long he'd forgotten what life was like without it. He knew more about how the people here died than he did about the first 15 years of his life. I don't need help. He knew what he was doing. Blake saw her leader walk through the door long before he approached her. She'd become not adept, but perhaps passable at reading his expressions. This one was new to her, however, an unusual mixture of frustration, humor, and anger. "Hello there," he said, sitting down opposite. "Studying again? My, someone's clearly very concerned for their theory scores." The sarcasm in his voice let her know he knew full well what she was doing, or rather, what she was not doing. She didn't know how, but she didn't question it either. He had that annoying ability to just know. "You look annoyed," she fired back, ignoring his comment entirely. "Oobleck talks too much." He shrugged. "Not to mention there's a little issue I have at the moment." Blake turned the page on a newspaper, discarding it when there was something more she needed. Her other hand jotted something down on a notepad. "Aren't you going to ask what it is?" He grinned. "Why bother? I have the feeling you won't go away without telling me." Another newspaper appeared before her, golden eyes scanning across the page. "Why don't you try to talk to Weiss about it instead?" "Already have. That's part of the problem." The article was obscured by a finger, Jaune covering the words as he gently tugged it away. Blake gripped tightly, trying to pull it back, but she didn't want to rip it. "You see," he said, "a certain daughter of mine has started to act all moody and antisocial. I said it was just puberty, but Weiss seems to think she's too old for that. What do you think, Blake? What should I do?" "Leave her alone," she gritted, finally pulling the newspaper free. "She knows what she's doing." "That's the thing." His eyes turned hard, all traces of humor gone as he looked down on her. "I don't think she does. If you're here to preach, I'm not in the mood." She'd had enough of that from Yang already, trying to make her break off this investigation. Did they not realize the danger? "I know what you mean," he drawled, reaching for one of her discarded articles and looking through it. "Sometimes I feel the need to catch up on my daily dose of terrorism's latest too. Nice to find someone that shares my interests." "Jaune," Blake warned, hissing his name. "No?" He raised an eyebrow, glancing back down at the page. "Ah, I get it. You're an enthusiast on kerning, aren't you? Can't stand it myself, especially when someone doubles it up." He was trying to get a reaction out of her. He was trying to get her angry. Blake took a deep breath, ignoring him entirely as she picked up a different newspaper and started to read it. Her hand shook as the pages folded inwards, his fingers poking as he leaned in close. "Oh, I love cartoons. Hold it there for me, will ya?" Blake slammed her hands down on the table, pushing the newspaper down too as she glared at him. "No cartoons? Why do you have to be so aggravating? You could give Yang lessons with irony that thick. Excuse me? Nothing." "Nothing." Jaune glanced away as he chuckled, but the way he leaned further into his seat said he wouldn't be going anywhere in a hurry. "So, I've been nominated to check on you after your little tantrum." "It's not a tantrum, Jaune. In case you're not aware, the White Fang have been stepping up recruitment. You... She paused, wondering whether she was right or not. It felt like she was, despite how he acted. He knew things. You know that means bad things, she said, watching his face. It's not something to be ignored. His expression was not an easy one to read. There was his usual stupid smile, the one he wore when he wanted her to think he was nothing more than a lazy buffoon. She didn't fall for that anymore and knew to look past it. It was his eyes which gave him away. Those blue irises which remained hard and focused on her. The corner twitched just the slightest bit. They're not being ignored, he said. Didn't that article last night say their place was raided? It did. She swallowed. That had been a surprise. Not just to hear that they were stepping up activities in the town, but that the authorities were finally going to do something about it. But that would just be a setback to the people who I used to work with. You don't know how they operate, Jaune. You don't know these people. Don't! The clipped word cut her off. His eyes were shut now, teeth clenched as he tilted his head down towards the table. Blake's breath caught, though she wasn't sure why. When he opened his eyes once more, the oppressive aura was gone. But his little smile didn't warm her. It was colder than any winter storm. I think I know more than enough about how they operate, Blake. I had to fight them at the docks, remember? That was true. Not that she could ever forget him saving her life like that. The memory was enough to curb her anger, if only a little. There was no point getting angry at him, not when she owed him so much. It's not quite the same, she whispered, looking around to see if any others were listening. She would never normally have been so candid, but he was in the unique position of already knowing much of the truth. My old partner, Adam. He's much worse than the faunus you fought at the docks. He was fully willing to blow up that train you were on, killing everyone there. I know, Jaune said. I was there. He was distracted, she said, flashing at that memory of just how. He's normally a lot more focused, and I can tell you now, he won't give up just because one little meeting got raided. He'll come back bigger, and with more men until he achieves his goal. And what do you? He poked a finger against her nose, making her scrunch it up. Think you can do about it? I can stop him, can you? You couldn't even stop Roman and those White Fang at the docks. What can you do alone against this partner of yours? Her eyes clenched shut, breath coming out in a rush as she was forced to accept that bitter truth. She had been a fool. True. But even had she been on top form, she didn't know if she could have beaten Torchwick. Even if she could, Adam was another matter entirely. With Sun, the two of them had been beaten so soundly, left to face the harsh reality of death. She would have died if it wasn't for... Help me. Pardon? She bit her lip, almost enough to make it bleed. I said help me. Please. I can't do it alone, but I'm going to try no matter what. You were able to fight the White Fang. An image flashed through her mind, the sickening sight of him killing her old comrades. He killed them, just like that. But against someone like Adam, was that kind of brutality what was needed? If you come with me, then it would be safer. We could do it. Or we could die, he said. Keep in mind that my apparent win over Roman Torchwick wasn't exactly real. He blew himself up. You know that isn't true. She snapped, glaring at him. I was there, Jaune. I made that up to cover for you. I know full well you did that on purpose, that you went in there fully prepared to kill him. If that shocked her leader, then he didn't show it. Instead of rolling his eyes as though that should have been obvious. What are you? She wanted to ask. What kind of man was he that he could think of life and death in such simple terms? Before, she had been afraid of that cold look. Back when she'd seen him threaten Winchester, it didn't bother her now. He was dangerous, yes. There was also something wrong with him. She was aware of it. But the thought of him actually trying to hurt her just seemed stupid. Impossible, even. Jaune wouldn't hurt her. He wouldn't hurt anyone on their team. It was with a little shock that Blake realized just how much she trusted him. Please. She begged. I'm not going to force you, but I will do this on my own otherwise. I can't let this go. But it would be so much safer if you were there as well. That way you can okay. She stared at him, eyes wide. Huh? I said okay. He shrugged. I'll do it. What? You will? She gasped, waiting for him to shout that it was a joke. He didn't. He just watched her with a serious expression. No tricks. This isn't some kind of joke? Do I look like the kind of person who would joke about this? She wanted to say yes, but she just wasn't sure. Jaune was normally so lazy and danger avoidant that this just didn't make sense. But he rushed out to protect you before, her mind pointed out. Is it really so strange that he would do that again? Thank you. Blake bowed her head, letting out a long sigh of relief. Finally, someone was listening. Someone was willing to do something. Thank you so much. I know I'm asking a lot, but I really do appreciate it. Don't get excited yet, Blake. There are conditions. Conditions? First of all, you need to get some sleep. She opened her mouth to complain, but he beat her to it. If we're going out somewhere with a chance of combat, then it makes no sense for you to be exhausted. If you want to stop them, you'll need to be rested. I agree to that. It wouldn't be wasting time if it was preparing for them to go on a raid. Adam had forced rest on them too, before every big mission. So long as they were doing something and not just letting the Fang get away with things, it would be fine. I'll get a full night's sleep tonight. Secondly, you will apologize to the other— I will. She nodded. It had been childish of her to rant at them in the first place. This wasn't their fault and she already known an apology was needed. She just hadn't quite been sure how and when. And finally, you let me know where and what we're doing in advance. And you don't rush into danger without talking to me first. You already know you can't do this alone. The last thing we need is you going lone wolf again when we're supposed to be working together. As a team. That demand was a little harder to agree with, especially since she knew what he was like. Still, now that she had someone willing to help her, someone who was capable of fighting against the White Fang, she wasn't going to waste it. Perhaps he was right too. She had a team, as much as she didn't want to involve Yang and Weiss in this. Fine, she said. With one hand she pushed a newspaper across the table, drawing his attention to the main story. This is an old safe house I know of, she said. With their last base gone, there's a good chance they'll regroup here. At the very least, it should have some signs of their presence. Evidence we might be able to use. I see. We'll go there tomorrow or the day after, but not until I see you get some rest and make up with the others. Blake smiled in relief, collapsing back in her seat. He agreed. It was done. And they would be checking the place out tomorrow, or close enough to that. She'd make sure she was rested so that he couldn't make any excuses. I'll apologize to them now, she said. I'll make up with them and get some sleep. I'll stop doing this on my own and I won't rush off alone like the last time. I promise. And I promise I'll help you. He sighed. Thank you. Blake whispered, actually pausing for a second as she felt the uncomfortable urge to hug him. She didn't. That would probably be a little strange. But the urge was there. I will go apologize now. Thank you again, Jaune. You have no idea how much this means to me. He didn't say anything as she slipped by and out of the room. her hand pausing halfway to touch his shoulder and thanks. He only watched as she left the room, sighing once she was gone he could look down at the discarded newspaper. Another safe house, he whispered, reading through the details. Blake wouldn't stop her hunt willingly. He'd known it was a stupid idea to even try and convince her. It was a good job that he hadn't bothered then. I'm sorry, Blake, he whispered, putting the newspaper clipping away in his pocket and standing up to leave. I've never been very good at keeping promises. He had a party to crash.